Hi everyone, good afternoon. It's nice to be here today, and we have our speaker Ake Velo here today. We are so privileged to have him. I know his busy schedule must have been a great honor for him to schedule us into it today. We are so grateful to have you around. Thank you. And I would love to start with each of us introducing ourselves so that they can know those is in the room with, especially that we are not many today. And then I will go to his bio, then we will go to the question and answer. So please, can you go? I guess we should start with Merv, since you are the main lady today, the first lady today.
I am Merve Saraj. I am a fourth year graduate student in the doctoral program at UW-Madison, Educational Psychology. And this is a very meaningful session for me, actually, because I'm working on test security related statistical methods. So it's going to be really exciting for me to hear what you think about the rights and responsibilities of the test users are.
When you say test security related statistical methods, does that mean that you're one of those who are designing the probability algorithms for saying who's cheating?
Totally.
Oh yeah, me and you got beef. Me and you got beef. Okay.
I can go now. I can go next. My name is Sergio Araneda. I am a third year PhD student at UMass Amherst. And yeah, I started in mathematics, actually, in applied mathematics a long time ago. And then I moved into more specific on educational measurement. I've been more interested recently in things about validity and yeah, having a variety of other more technical stuff, but mainly validity and how do you relate that with user experience and like a way of doing tests that is more centered around the user and the experiences of the users. That's kind of my thing. And yeah, it's very nice to have you today.
Art?
Yeah, I can go next. Hello, everyone. My name is Parth Soni, and I am a third-year PhD student at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, India. It's basically a management school, but my research interest lies in the field of educational assessments and testing. So for my dissertation, I'm currently exploring. I'm more interested in the areas like fairness and equity in testing, having socio-culturally diverse responsive assessments, as well as test security. And I mean, quite similar to what Mer said earlier, that designing models to understand the cheating in the tests and so on, and ensuring more fairness and secure tests. So these are the areas which I'm currently exploring for my dissertation. Thanks.
You're muted, Olumuyiwa.
I'm so sorry. So I am Olumuyiwa Desmenu. I am a graduate student at the University of Kentucky, currently completing my second year and going into my third year. I am in my dissertation year already. So my proposal is currently on interdisciplinary competencies, finding ways to access interdisciplinary competencies. But I'm focusing on a particular project called the CAREC project, because that project was designed to develop interdisciplinary candidates for what do you call it, for a particular occupational health, yeah, in Kentucky region. So I'm looking at their dissertation and thesis and see whether they are really doing that, and to also do psychometrics around the instruments I'm developing. I'm going to develop a rubric to assess their dissertation, and that will be used further from here it might also be applied to other theses from there also. So that's what I'm currently looking at doing. And hopefully my committee will approve everything. They've been showing indications of not going to give approval, especially to interacting with the students on the program. So it might likely be, I will just be on the thesis and that will likely be all. But beyond that, I am also looking at maybe eventually automating the rubrics to make thesis grading easier, maybe later on, but that's maybe for a future thing beyond my dissertation. It's nice to be here. It's nice to meet everyone. And thank you, Akil, for coming. Well, our speaker today is Akil Bello. I hope I pronounced well. Thank you. He is the Senior Director of Advocacy and Advancement at Fairtest and a freelance education policy consultant and analyst. He possesses a bachelor's degree in architecture. I have questions around that. Maybe later you're going to be responding to that. How an architect became an educational advocate. Maybe you will likely tell us in your introduction. So he has numerous initiatives along his career related to test preparation, college admission, and student advocacy. He was the founding partner of Education by Partner, he is the founding partner and CEO for the company Bell Curves. Yeah, a startup founded with the mission to increase access to higher education by partnering with other organizations and institutions to serve low-income and underrepresented communities to develop highly customized test preparation solutions and admission information. He was the Director of Strategic Initiatives and later Director of Equity and Access at the Princeton Review, a company for test preparation. I'm sure some of us might be familiar with that company. He currently writes at Forbes on articles about educational access, admission, and testing. Sir, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, I guess the only thing I'll add to that is, you know, I accidentally got involved in testing and education. I was a college student looking for a job, and proctoring standardized tests paid well, and I got to sit on my butt and make money doing nothing. So I ended up working at Princeton Review for 13 years, teaching all the standardized tests. So most of my perspective starts with admissions tests, which are a little bit different from accountability tests and career, and career assessment tests. So unless I'm specific about that distinction, just know that I will forget the other test and fall back into the admissions test realm, which is narrow in a different way. But I taught all the major admissions tests that exist, like SAT, GMAT, GRE, LSAT, wrote materials for them, trained teachers for them. So I've been through those tests. I've explored education largely through those tests over the last 30 years. So that's the short story about me and testing.
Can I do a comment? Because I remember when I started to look for an expert for this chapter in particular, I thought you were the best person for this, because in your trajectory, you have had this point of view that is closer to the test taker.
Mm-hmm.
And I have this feeling that you may have the right point of view to criticize and to examine this chapter in particular that is about rights and responsibilities. So yeah, I hope I did the right. I understood your path in the right way.
I think you did. Yes.
Great.
I actually think it's really interesting because I've looked at so I'm a dabbler. Right? I'm not pursuing my PhD intentionally because I don't want to learn the statistics to understand the math that goes into the research reports. Right? So I read the research reports and the validity studies and skip over the math and read the conclusions and look at the charts. Right? So I've looked at the headlines of all of the standards and haven't dug deep into them. And I'm usually in section 12 around use of scores, because to me that's sort of the most egregious and most commonly ignored portion of it. But section 8, I was looking at it in preparation for this, and I find it really interesting because I do think that's another place where it's all theory and not actually practiced at all. None of those rights and responsibilities do students have. Those are all rights and responsibilities that the companies choose to adhere to or not. You know, and I find, you know, thinking about the cheating thing, you know, Merv, you mentioned that, like, I've had students who've had their scores challenged and they get the letter that said, we did a probability analysis that said your answers were too close to the person next to you, right? Which makes me laugh, given that there are only 5 answer choices, right? They're, you know, if I go to the same school as these other kids, what's the probability that we get the same wrong answers? It seems pretty high. So to base discounting my scores entirely on a probability analysis on a multiple choice test with distractor answers built in, it seems really sketchy to make such a high stakes decision based on a mere probability analysis. You know, and I don't know if that's the limit of what they do, but that's certainly how, that's also part of the problem with information. That's how they convey it to me, who has somewhat of a level of expertise to understand this. I can't imagine what a test taker, a teenager, is thinking when they get that letter. You know, actually, one of my favorite things is I cheated in high school on the SAT twice. I took it for a friend of mine. That's right. They paid me $50. I got a fake ID, and I went and took the SAT for my friend. I think it was like in March. And then I did it again for another friend the next test, like in May. But the fun thing that happened was, I think either like while I was taking the May test or the day after, the letter comes from college, was like, yeah, we think you cheated. Do you want to cancel your score? So I was caught cheating on the first test, basically while taking the second one, right? And I think they sent a letter. I was like, we looked at the handwriting, and that's why I learned why they make you do the paragraph by hand at the end of the test. They're like, we looked at the handwriting sample and your score was too high. And knowing that I cheated, of course, we said, yes, please cancel the scores. But, you know, so it's interesting to have all these different viewpoints, you know, but the processes by which they create these challenges to students' scores who they don't think are valid don't allow a lot of room for students to contest them or to have transparency into the process. And I think that's one huge issue. There's a famous case Princeton Review used to talk about a swimmer who like broke his arm and took the SAT like the day after breaking his arm, so he was on drugs. Got a terrible score, then took a Princeton Review class, then took the test again, and his scores went up 400 points. And they challenged it on the basis of his increase. But they wouldn't accept any of the evidence he offered around why his score would have differed that much, right? And he had to go to arbitration. And of course, these companies are like, the resolution they offer you is basically they control the court, right? They offer you their arbiter to adjudicate what's going on with this issue. And so I think even if the processes that allow them to challenge scores are reasonable, I'm not sure that I understand them well enough to say they're reasonable. Even if they were, I find that the process they offer a student and the speed they offer the test takers to resolve these questions are problematic. I've always told students, if you get challenged with your test scores, just accept it, cancel it, and move on to the next test, because you won't get it resolved fast enough for the scores to be meaningful. And that just shouldn't be the case, right? If you're trying to apply to college and you took the test today and they challenge it and they're going to drag out that process 6 months, you can't wait for that. So, and the standards don't address that, right? They don't address the speed with which it should have to happen.
And there is no need to take responsibility if you do a mistake in that process too.
Right. There's no admission of any mistakes that might have had, like, there's no transparency into the process at all. You just have to accept their word, right? That like from what I've seen over the years, they challenge the scores without giving you specifics around what the new score is versus the old. So you don't even know if you did well, right? Like, I think what I recall from high school is I was told I did over 300 points higher than the previous score. But as a test prep person, I've had students score 300 points higher. So why would that be a number that triggers a challenge, right? But then they said over 300 points, because I think they're trying not to reveal to the public that there is a specific number that triggers a challenge. So there's all of the concerns of them not trying to reveal information, but in the process, that creates unfairness for the persons whose scores they're challenging, right? If I had done a whole lot of prep and actually had increased my score 400 points, now I have to be worried about retaking a test because 400 points means you think I'm cheating. And so there's a strangeness to the process and a lack of transparency that exacerbates the problems, all of the other problems with the test. Another good example now that's just popping into my mind is, I don't have any specific examples, but if you actually really want to get into pushing this and making them fix these processes, over the last few years, there have been multiple reports about both College Board and ACT challenging scores months after they were delivered to students. And this is particularly egregious with something like college admissions, where let's say you take a test in November, you apply for admissions, you get your acceptance in December, your scores get challenged in January. Like, how is that reasonable? Actually, that happened to me with the GMAT. I forgot about that. Okay, now I do engage in shenanigans. So I took the GMAT computer adaptive test once, and there was a sign above the lockers that said, oh, first they said you had to put all your stuff in the lockers. And there was a sign above the lockers that said, not responsible for anything left here. So I'm supposed to leave all my belongings, but you're saying no responsibility on your part. So I didn't leave my wallet. I took my wallet into the GMAT with me, because I'm not going to leave my wallet if you are not going to be responsible for it. That seems fair. Well, they wrote me up. And about a month after the test, I get a letter from GMAC that says, you didn't leave your wallet, you were written up for a security concern, please explain yourself. I ignored the letter. They said, explain yourself or we'll cancel your score. So I ignored the letter. Another 3 or 4 months passed by. So this time I could have applied to business school and been accepted. Another few months passed by, and they finally, I think it was 6 months before they canceled my score.
And what happened?
I wasn't applying to business school, so it didn't actually matter. But if I were, I could have been admitted to school, right? And then they're choosing to cancel. Now, part of that responsibility is definitely on me, choosing to ignore their letters that clearly said we might cancel your scores. But their initial timing on that was still fairly long after I had already taken the test and received my score. So there are multiple examples of the timing of these score challenges that are systemically problematic. And if they're going to challenge scores, there has to be a window by which, if you haven't challenged it by now, you just can't challenge it.
I totally agree. And I think that is due to the focus on proving cheating on exams. If we shift that focus to something to make up for that suspectful case, that would be a whole different story, which comes at a lower cost. But proving cheating focus, I'm not a pro proving cheating person, is wrong. I think it's really inherently wrong.
Right. I think that there should be something that distinguishes withholding scores for suspicion, which is a lot of what I've heard about recently with SAT and ACT. They will withhold scores for a long time and say they are researching something, they have suspicions, this and that, but they just drag it out forever, right? And if you can't resolve it within 2-3 weeks after scores are released, then it just should be too late. Because they're putting the onus on the test taker, who has access to no information, essentially, to prove that they did not cheat.
Wow. It's a whole lot that you have raised already. But we have some questions. I'm sure you possibly have seen those questions prior to now. Do you mind addressing them? Do I need to read them out to you, or you will just address them one after the other?
Okay, I'll just go in order. How do we ensure that all test takers have equal access to practice materials and test info? So that's an interesting question. So I guess I'll sort this a little bit. I'm just thinking about distinctions between admissions test, accountability test, and other types of tests. So I'm going to restrict it to sort of admissions and accountability. I guess it applies the same to all of them. So my first thought is the cost of practice material is an issue and is a barrier, right? So as long as practice material costs money, there will not be equal access. High stakes tests should make practice material, a significant volume of practice material widely available. College Board doesn't do a bad job. They have 8 SAT tests that are publicly available. That's probably as good as I think it can get in terms of public availability of practice material. And they're available for free. ACT, on the other hand, has 1 practice test that is publicly available. And I think it's actually behind a sign up on their website. GMAT and GRE each have 2 practice tests that you can download, right? But so I think one of the questions is volume, right? Statewide tests tend to have practice questions available, not full test. And what I find is statewide tests prioritize the profit margin of the test publisher over the public good. They don't want to release test items because they would because then the test company would have to make more and lose profit, right? Which is problematic on a number of levels. As a test prep person for 30 years, the tests that weren't released, I just would sign up for the test, go take it, and remember questions and write them down. My practice material would be based on questions that I've seen in real tests. Now that's not doable that's harder to do for accountability tests. But I do know of prep companies that will interview their clients afterwards so they can create a pool of questions of their own and essentially use those in prep. Right now, the test prep industry is so sophisticated, your assumption should be if a test is available, a test prep organization will spring up to prepare people for that test. That test prep organization will do everything they can to access real questions. Right? And there are lots of examples of memorizing questions, of having test takers memorize questions. There was the Kobayashi the top score scandal with the GMAT. There was a company that was a website where people would go in at the beginning of the month. It was the computer adaptive test, and they cycled the pool of items about every 30 days. So some clever company would send people in the first 30 days. They would memorize as much as they can. They would write them all down, put them on a website, and then people would pay for premium access to those questions. Now, they were busted, but my assumption is for every company that's caught, there's another 5 that got away with it. So, the prioritization of the company not having to write a ton of questions hurts the public good when the only access to quality questions is, a few publicly available questions, which is definitely the case with accountability tests. It's a little bit less so with some of the admissions tests. And I don't really look at credentialing tests, so I can't speak to that. But every time I have looked at credentialing tests, what I found is that the only place that I can find practice material is generally through a prep company selling them. And I always wonder about the quality of that material, because as somebody who has written test questions, I know that generally third-party test questions are terrible. I've written a ton of bad questions and sold them to people, because I just don't have the time and the money to vet them. The SAT claims that they spend like $2 million per question or something stupid like that. It's like, yeah, I'm spending $3 per question, right? So there's definitely the issue of how do you provide access to high quality practice, right? That satisfies the budgetary requirements of the testing publishers, who generally just want to rake in as much profit as possible, right? So that's the challenge. But I think that if you're just operating from the theory that some business will pop up around this test, then you have to do everything you can so that not only people who have access to that business have access to quality preparation material. And another example of that was, for a long time, until this year, there was a website called Crack ACT, which may still exist in some version, shape, or form. Basically, they took all the released tests historically, and they put them on a website for download. Now, it wasn't widely known. So people who have less information, who don't have tutors, who knew about it? All the tutors. I charge $400 an hour sometimes to tutor SAT and ACT. $400 an hour, I'll tell you where all the ACTs are on the internet. And I have PDFs of all of them. The kid who's hoping his math teacher in school helps him out on the test does not have access to that. So he has access to the one free one on ACT's website, right? Or maybe the book that's in the library, because it's a $30 book in the bookstore, so he gets the one from the library that might be 5 years old. So practice materials is a huge issue, right? I think computer-based practice is going to make that worse, because with anything adaptive, having a larger item bank that's necessary, which means there are going to be fewer quality tests available, right? Which means that if College Board has 8 tests available now, is that going to go down to 1 or 2? Which now means a test prep company is going to step into the gap and produce their own. And now only people who have access to that test prep company, right, and now paying $100, $200, whatever it is, to have access to more than one practice test, right? So the minute there is a restriction of resources due to cost, you're advantaging the wealthy, right? I'm not as sure about the language barrier part of this question. And this is going to sound terrible, but I'm going to say it anyway. If it's preparation for American universities, then the expectation is that you will study in English. So to what extent is there an expectation to translate the preparation materials? And that's a legitimate question that I have. And I'm not going to try to answer it. I'm gonna let y'all have to deal with that. But I'm not sure that it needs to be translated if the expectation is that you're coming here to study in English.
I'm not sure who asked that question, but maybe they refer to for instance, you talked about these sources available on the web, right? If they don't know the typical keywords to search for, browse for these sources, maybe they would be disadvantaged in that regard because they're not too familiar with that language.
They will. And I mean, we definitely understand the restrictions of search engines and search keys. I think that's in part, I guess the way standards could address that is practice materials should be readily and easily and clearly available on all websites, right? And that's a huge issue. Like even 30 years in, if I'm trying to find, you know, the test to do whatever, right? It might take me 3 hours of searching to find a practice test. And that shouldn't be a thing, right? And again, I usually do this for admissions. So various high schools in the United States have admissions tests. So I was looking at the test schools in the US, all of which use different tests, right? And finding out what test they use, who the publisher is, and try to get hold of a practice test is almost impossible, right? I couldn't do it. I took a list of maybe 15 schools that required tests for admissions to ninth grade. The reason I'm specific to ninth grade is because it's way easier for college, where colleges fairly universally use the SAT or the ACT. So those coming from big publishers, universally used, are really easy to find. The smaller, narrower tests become harder to find, which is understandable, but it doesn't solve the problem, right? And that I think is part of the issue. Is there's an excuse making that exists around volume of test taking, right? The ISEE and the SSAT don't have a publicly available technical report, right? Like, how's that not a thing? How could you have a test that you're giving to more than 10,000 kids per year and there's no publicly available technical report? That should be real basic thing, but doesn't exist. It's hard to understand, you know, what's a good test, what's not. You're relegated to using test prep companies and taking them at their word around what the test actually contains. So that's really, I think the question around practice material really becomes around making it as easy as possible to have a reasonable volume of high quality practice, of retired items. Let's not even say high quality practice, of at least 2 retired tests. Because a pool of items isn't useful. At least 2 retired tests with scoring keys and conversion charts, right? Because I can cite you chapter and verse of tests that won't release their conversion charts. Like, why is this a mystery? Why is it a mystery for me to know how you go from number right to score on the test? And examples are like the SSAT and ISEE. They release practice tests, but no conversion charts. The conversion chart actually, I think, does ranges and percentiles, but like monstrously large ranges. Like a raw score of 20 will give you anywhere in this 70-point range or something like that. And in this 15 to 25 percentile point range. So like, how do you do anything with that information, right? The SHSAT in New York, which is used as the sole means of admission to 8 public schools in New York. Let's talk about standards. That's a violation of the standards right there. It's used as the sole means of a high stakes decision, and they don't release a conversion chart. So you have no idea what your 27 questions correct means.
Sorry, and as a follow-up, I didn't think about the impact of making a test adaptative and how that actually can have like implications in terms of equity and access to materials, and how difficult it can be to create proper materials for that specific way of providing the test.
Correct.
Because it's true, I mean, in a regular paper and pencil test, it can be difficult to find prep materials. If you make it adaptative, it can make it even worse.
Yes.
So, and that adds up to the gaps that can be created by money and press preparation and so on. So yeah, That's very interesting.
And so, yeah, the testing companies like to ignore that, right? They like to pretend that giving one test publicly or giving a practice item is meaningful, right? You know, what impact scores, what allows students to do their best performance is sitting down for the experience and experiencing it in full, probably multiple times. So that's why I say at a minimum 2 full tests with conversion charts. Right? If you're not giving me that, then nothing else you give me is useful. You can describe the test all you want. You can release specs. You can release, you know, specifications, but that's just not meaningful to a test taker. They don't know what that means. They don't know what, you know, and College Board and some of these testing agencies just release dumb stuff like the SAT tests the heart of algebra. Oh, great. I'm going to go prepare for the heart of algebra because I know what the hell that means. Right? It's like the passport to advanced math. There's lots of passport to advanced math on the test. So specifications become meaningless unless you have the expertise to decode them, right? So the simplest thing is multiple full-length tests with scoring. The next question was about informed consent.
Excuse me, before you go to the next question, I was wondering, how about if the companies wield proprietary rights and intellectual property concerns around releasing their text, practice, questions, and other things? What do you see that regarding public good and equity and all those?
In theory, there is nothing proprietary about these tests.
Okay.
You're testing things I was supposed to have learned in school. So there actually should be nothing proprietary about these tests, about the content of the exams themselves, right? The scoring algorithm shouldn't be so mysterious that it has to be proprietary.
Okay.
If it is, then what the hell is that? Like, why is there some mystical algorithm to understand how the test is scored? Right? I think that a lot of that is simply hiding the problems with the test. Right? So the SAT, right, releases 3 of 7 tests per year. When I take the conversion chart, so I do things like I'll pull up the conversion chart of the SAT and look at the raw score to scale score conversion. They claim a standard error of measurement of about 30 points in math, right? But they don't release all the tests. I took all the conversion charts that I could get my hand on. I put them in a grid on a spreadsheet. I found 90-point standard error of measure. I think that's why they don't release the conversion charts. They don't want people like me to dig around into their test and find out that they're juking the stats. Right? Like that's a problem that 53 of 58 math questions on one day could give me a 680, on the next test might give me a 670. I understand there's some standard error of measure, but 90 points? That's almost a sixth of the available score. That's kind of nuts. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a PhD. I have never taken advanced level statistics. I'm just putting numbers in a spreadsheet. And I'm like, damn, 90's bigger than you told me. 90's a lot bigger. Yes, you gave me an average, but I did not expect that average to have a range of 90 points from the test I was able to find publicly, not counting the ones you did not release, which I'm gonna just go out on a limb here and say, all the ones that had a crappy curve, you probably gave them a non-public test. What else would I assume? So part of the issue with all of this is that the more that's withheld, the more people like me who's suspicious of the test to begin with find additional problems that indicate that much of this is potentially statistical shenanigans. And I would love someone to prove me wrong. Like I'd be real happy to go like, I cannot, you lying, man. Look, here's all the curves. You found the one weird test that was crazy. Stop talking. Like, but they've never ever like, I'm public. I'm on Twitter every day. Here's what I'm looking at. Here's my spreadsheet. Show me I'm wrong. Never happens. I will shut up real quick.
Can I ask you something? Because in other chapters of the standards, when the standards start to speak about error of measurement and things like that, actually the standard usually they don't ask test publishers to provide like a specific measure, like the number of error of measurement. They usually ask to at least show reliability, which is slightly different and kind of hides the more concrete number that you can actually use to assess how variable or how imprecise is the score.
Right.
So yeah, you say you did this exercise with your spreadsheet, etc. But did you that exercise came from some intuition that you felt that the test was being a kind of unreliable, and then you did that? Or I mean, there was something more experiential, if you want, about that suspicious that the score was having a lot of error, and there was this statistical shenanigan behind, or not? Do you think that it came more from your experience, or it came more from the analysis that you did?
I did the analysis because I was suspicious. And I probably was suspicious because I think one thing that test publishers don't really take into account enough these days is that the internet exists, right? Reddit is a cesspool of kids talking about everything that exists on the test, right? So if you want to really see what people think about the test, go on and join Reddit and get into one of those SAT forums. Go onto one of the GMAT forums and look at the sophistication of, like, what is it called? Shoot. There are two big GMAT forums, and the sophistication with which they discuss test items and testing itself is actually pretty interesting. Now, sometimes it goes, off the deep end, but what you'll find is people so one of the things that I was able to do, I compiled some of those conversion charts, because after every SAT, kids go on Reddit and they're like, I got 7 wrong and I got this score. I got this many wrong and I got that score, right? And they start comparing their numbers. Well, if you have enough people doing that, you get a full conversion chart, right? You find out that like 3 people have said they got different numbers from the same raw score. So there were probably different test forms that day, right? And you start to get an understanding. If you have enough of the background of testing, you start to realize what's going on in these forums and what they're actually discussing, right? And so what I like to do is I take things like that and I just try to formalize it and get a full picture of what is being told to me, right? And often what happens is I end up with questions, with more questions than I started with, right? And what's really unfortunate is the testing companies could have solved it a long time ago. Why not release a full conversion chart with every test? Right? You don't have to give all the questions out, just give the conversion chart. Then there's just no mystery. Right? Like, it's not like somebody can use a conversion chart to decode the exam and figure out, like, you can't do nothing with that except it's more information that's available, and therefore it's more transparent. So
it just feels like they don't want to deal with explaining why they are different and why they are using different test forms. And on a level, it seems like if we want to be fully disclosing the process and how can I say, having the full transparency, then it puts a lot of pressure on the testing programs to get people actually literate, psychometrically literate people to understand what the test score is, what the report is saying really. And not everybody has the same level of literacy to understand the score reports either. So it's mostly, I feel like testing programs are taking on that responsibility to communicate what it is from the people.
You're right, but I think I look at it a slightly different way. So I think you're right, and I think there's 2 different things, right? I think the test report to the test taker can be separate from available information to people who want to research, right? I think a lot of test takers, especially teenagers, they just want their score and they're done with it. They're not going to do a whole lot more than that. So I don't know that you need to mail them a conversion chart and test specifications, but those should be available on the web, on the internet somewhere, right? The fact that there's a large-scale standardized test that exists that I can't simply Google test X, test specifications or manual or whatever it is and find it right away is a problem. That should be available for any test, and it should be free. Right? There's no reason that I couldn't just Google every major standardized test and find their technical manual. It's ridiculous that that doesn't exist.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
So that's really what I'm kind of talking about, that. And then if we want to get more granular, that after a test is administered, there's some kind of test information release that is also available to those who want it. And like, I don't think you want to send it to students. Now, most people don't want that. Most people are like, but I think accountability test should absolutely be doing that, right? And an accountability test, especially school-based tests, right, should be doing a better job of conveying, like, they should just be giving more information to test takers, to end users, right? Well, actually, I guess that's the question. Largely, statewide accountability tests, the end user is the state, not the student. But they shifted the penalties onto the teachers and the students without increasing the availability of information, right? My son took an Iowa test and then I opted him out because he took the Iowa test. I got back some report with random categories and maybe counts of rights and wrong and nothing else. Well, what the hell can I do with that? I can't fix anything. I can't tell him what he did right or wrong. I can't look at it. So why am I going to subject him to 3 hours of a test that can't help him? I'm not going to do it. And especially these days where they could simply make things available online. It doesn't cost them any money to publish it, to print it and mail it to me, right? There's no reason that within 8 weeks of a test that all the results aren't available in some portal somewhere, right? But most statewide systems still take months to get scores back. So they're not useful to students, they're not useful to teachers, they're not useful to parents. Of course I'm going to opt out. The value only accrues to the state, and the state's doing nothing with it to help me in my community.
Akil, sorry, we have been following up this question so much, but I think this is great. Let me ask you another follow-up question, because there has been some conversations about the possibility of, quote, putting teeth into the standards, meaning that find a way of making mandatory or having more coercion, if you want, in the testing industry in certain things. And eventually it can be some, I don't know, part of law, or can be some institution that can check upon the testing agencies, or I don't know. So do you think that could actually help or not? Do you think, because a lot of the things you are saying seems to me like easy things to check. So for example, to have technical manuals that are available. That I also agree that that should be a minimum. But there is no law, there is no rule that says that a testing company should do that. And even if the standards say that type of information should be available, it's just words in a book, but nothing else. So what do you think about like putting teeth on these standards?
I would love to see that happen for some of the standards. Like sole measure, right? Whatever that is, that's like 12B or whatever it is. I only know of one institution that violates that standard. But it's absolutely ridiculous that New York City is admitting, is having 30,000 students take this test. They don't get any results back. They get a score and nothing else. And there's a hard cutoff into this school or not. Right? That's a clear violation of the standards. There should be some way to enforce that. And at a minimum, the joint organizations should publicly denounce and call out people violating the standards. Right? At a minimum, that's probably easier than law, because in New York City, it's state law to use the test in that way, right? So to get politicians to vote a law against their own bad practices and bad laws would be really hard to pull off, right? But I think that, and that applies to several standards here. If test agencies and test writers and psychometricians want more respect and less blowback from their industry, they need to take principled stands on the industry operating morally and properly, and they don't, right? If you take the leading companies, College Board loves to brag about the use of APs, but was silent when a judge in New Jersey let a rapist go because he had good test scores. Yup. I think he gave him a reduced sentence because he had good college prospects and good college scores. Yeah. College Board was silent. Right?
They had no statement?
None whatsoever that I've seen. I've never actually seen a testing agency make a statement that says that is misuse of my test. Do not use my test that way.
It's so convoluted.
Mm-hmm. But you will often find them making statements in support of the use of a test. Right? I'd love to go down the standard, like, let's find all the places where they've misused the SAT. Amazon used the SAT to help place headquarters too. They were very public about looking at SAT scores in different districts to help place where they were going to put their second headquarters. College Board is silent because it's in their financial interest to have the tests held on a pedestal. SAT's test scores are part of bond ratings of colleges. I'm pretty sure that's a violation of a standard.
Yeah. I mean, in their financial interest, but I think it's a very short interest, because when you add up all these situations that are clearly unacceptable, then you increase the rejection to the whole idea of having a test even. And that in the long term is actually a bad financial thing even. So even for a money thing, the testing industry should be more responsible.
It's worked for them for 100 years. Right? It's only now in the last 20 or so years that there's been real blowback around how these tests are used, right? But also they've ramped up the different ways in which testing has been used, right? So we're really getting to a point where, like, for me, I want a hard stop on all admissions testing, just because it's so ingrained in society that it's become, like, not because I think the content of the test is bad. I just think the way that tests are used and discussed and evaluated is so bad, it needs like a 10-year stop. Just, you can't test for 10 years until y'all stop thinking about it in such terrible ways, and then we can maybe start again. Today, MIT announced that they were going back to the SAT, and part of their justification was something like their internal studies showed that above a certain level, blah, blah, blah. Like, they basically said the scores were valid for them above a certain level. SAT scores go from 200 to 800 in math and in reading. MIT scores, their 25th percentile is a 790 out of 800. What research can you do when you're admitting, like, your 25th percentile is 790 out of 800? So essentially, not even one question accounts for the difference between their 25th percentile and the 100th percentile. And they're justifying the use of this test because somehow it's like, how can it be valid? You're telling me the person who got 1 out of 58 math questions wrong versus the person who got 0 out of 58 math questions wrong, it's significantly more predictive? Right? But this is a director of admissions who's been in a job forever, using the test forever, is somehow making this statement. So the overuse of tests and the pretense of a level of specificity and detail that they don't have has become really problematic. And I think that you have to teach, and what you were saying, Merv, around like educating users around testing is huge, right? And I don't know how to educate. That's why I just want to like wipe it all out. I think like the SAT would be a million times better if it was scored on a 1 to 5 scale. Because then we can stop pretending that the standard error of measure doesn't exist. And all these places with hard cutoffs at differentiation points that actually don't mean anything have to go away. But I don't control the testing industry. So College Board pretends they have 120 different points of distinction between students. And we all know that's not true. So, and it's slightly better in other arenas. With accountability testing, they do tend to focus on a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 scale rather than whatever numeric scaled score the testing company publishes, right? So with accountability testing, that's a little bit better. But when you get into admissions testing, I find that they pretend that the increment provided by the testing agency is a meaningful number. And they don't actually know the meaning of things like standard error of measure or standard error of difference. So.
Thank you so much. Can we go to the other question now?
Yep. The third one's easiest. Who should be involved in the process of defining rights for test takers? Parents, students, and test objectors, and privacy advocates. All of these people who are listed here, ARA, APA, all of those folks come from the standpoints of the tests are good, and I'm going to tell you what to do with them. And I want you to trust me with all of the info. Like, those aren't the people who should tell you about the rights for test takers. Test takers' rights should come from test takers and their immediate adjacent adults, right? I would love to see things like College Board not being able to sell data. College Boards, like, you register for a College Board test, they sell your name to colleges. Right? That's problematic use, because now they're motivated to get people testing as often as possible to feed their data churn. Right? That undermines, I think, the belief in the test and the faith in the agency creating the test. So I think those who have a financial interest in the test being obscure, accepted as the gospel, product that's defining all of these things should not be the people defining what student rights are.
Akil, sorry, I think we are close to the time, so we don't want to take much of your time. But if you want to continue, maybe we can spend
I got all the time. I'm good. I'll try to get through the rest of your questions. Since I've been rambling, I'll try to make sure I get to your questions. Do you think the rights are missing in the standard? I don't know what rights are in the standards. The rights I think are missing would be more clearly defining how cheating is, more clearly defining access to test information, access to question level information. Test takers and their support system, their teachers, their parents, need question level information in order to improve their performance, right? Test writers want simply to give the score, and they want you to accept on faith the score, and then they want to give you categorical information that they believe you can interpret in some way, right? So I think that the rights that I would add to the standards are defining, encouraging, requiring release of more of information starting from question level and working your way up, rather than starting from score level and working your way down. Right? And what will probably happen is you end up meeting somewhere in the middle, but for the test taker, the information that's useful is question level. They want to know what questions they got wrong and what mistakes did they make. test companies want to just tell you, here's a number, go away. That's not useful to me. So if you change the rules, if you want to change the rules of the game in test use in college admissions, how much time would you need to give students? When you say the rules of the game, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like changing the test itself or the way tests are used?
I wrote that question and I was thinking in general, what do you need to know in advance to prepare and successfully enter in college or some university if you want? Like, what are the rules? And the rules can be like, what's the test? What are the rules of use of the test, etc.
So I think each of those have different answers. So so let me see if I can answer them short and quick. If you're going to change the test content, format, structure, or items, probably at least 2 years, at a minimum, because the majority of people I've worked with, people who are preparing for these tests, are preparing, at a minimum, let's say at a minimum, people are preparing 4 months before they take the test, right? Which means they're planning for that 6, 8, 12 months before they take the test. The people who are aggressive are planning 2 years out, especially for a test you can take multiple times, right? So I think if there are going to be significant content changes, that have to happen several years in advance. Also, part of that is time for preparation material to be created, right? Which I go back and forth on whether I want to shorten the time and not allow prep companies to create materials, right? Which could have some benefits, or to allow more time to allow more prep companies to create materials, right? Because those have different implications. But in terms of the test itself, I'd probably say I'd love 2 years out, at least 1 year. In terms of use, that's different for something in college admissions because college admissions is so varied across different colleges, right? So I don't know that the standards could create, the standards could create guidelines for use, but I don't know that it would be very different from what exists currently. I think the guidelines for use wouldn't change test taker behavior. Like right now, the guidelines for use would only change who's admitted, not what test takers do to prepare for a test. If they can't do cutoffs anymore, they'll admit a different pool of students. They might admit more students, right? But that's not really going to change who prepares for it or how. So it is nice to know, but it's not, it's not like people have any clear understanding of how tests are used right now. There are a few different programs that kind of admit, usually the programs that admit how they use tests are admitting cutoffs and nothing else. So that's pretty easy to change and pretty simple to get the information you need to understand what the cutoff is. All right, let's see what other things here. Credentialing is interesting. I think the issue with credentialing that I would worry about is again, I think it all comes back to practice and preparation materials. The biggest issue I've ever seen with the credentialing stuff is that it's just impossible to find out what the hell is on the test and to have any clear understanding of what the tests actually are. Do I think the rights related to cheating? Oh, I think we already hit the cheating one pretty well. Yeah, the whole cheating thing has to be transparency. It has to be clear about timing, process, and triggers. I think those are the 3 areas that they have to create more clarity around cheating. What triggers a cheating investigation, what the timing for that investigation looks like, what the process of that investigation looks like, what your recourses are if you are caught up in a triggering in a cheating investigation. None of that do I know. Now, I've been in this industry for 30 years. I have vague notions of how that works, but I don't really know. I've seen maybe one letter, which is why I know what Merv was doing, because I've seen maybe one letter. I was like, wait a minute, random probability is how you say I cheated? Like, that seems weird. But that was because some test taker got the letter and they forwarded it to me, right? Like, there's nowhere you can actually go on their site and find information about that, which is problematic. At least they can describe the process. So, anything else?
No, I think we are good. Olumoyiwa?
Yeah, we're good. He has gone through all the questions. And he has raised more questions than
that's my goal, always to leave you with more work to do.
Yeah, this was
Wow.
really helpful. Really,
Yeah,
really
it
good
is.
discussion. Thank you.
It is extremely helpful.
I hope that, when you guys go forth and get your PhDs and are raking in the big bucks at the testing agencies, that you don't create terrible processes that I have to publicly call you out by name on Twitter. Merv did this. There's a new probability algorithm and it's all her fault.
No, I'm going to change that twisted focus to something else.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Akil,
Thank you so
for
much.
responding. Yes.
No problems. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week.
You too.
Wonderful evening and week too. Thank you. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Merv.